manera más inteligente de poder aprovechar el momento con Mr. Hank Paulson era que una persona, un académico respetado y amigo de nosotros pudiera conversar con él. Entonces, Carlos Elizondo, está en tus manos.
Well, it's a great privilege to have you today. He comes much more casual than we because he's en route to a sustainability meeting. We really appreciate you the time to being with us. We saw this video, so let's start with the past. I was thinking of starting with something else, but let's make the immediate link with the past. You faced one of the most difficult, or perhaps the most difficult crisis of recent history. You had recently moved to the public service because you had been all your life in the private sector, and suddenly you have to cope not with political economy, but with politics, because behind any interesting problem you have politics. And people can now claim you acted very slowly. Why didn't you intervene Lehman Brothers and stopped it from busting? Please explain to us a little bit the restrictions, because when one is seated in those kind of places, the restrictions are horrible. What would you say now, many years afterwards? Could things have been done different from your position?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you very much, and thank you all. Wendy and I very much enjoy visiting Mexico whenever we do, and you know, Roberto Hernandez and Claudia are great friends, and we thank Alejandro for inviting us. Okay, so private sector to the public sector. Fortunately, I came from a job in the public sector, in the private sector, where I was used to working with clients. And so I wasn't just a CEO, I was a CEO who worked with clients, and I understood what was required to build relationships and to sell people. Unfortunately, I had a year before the crisis hit to build the relationship of trust with George Bush, to work with members of Congress, and so on. Now, when the crisis came, and the crisis had been underway, the crisis began in July of 2007. Lehman Brothers was September of 2008. So 15 months after the crisis began. And as I look back on it now, although there are a lot of things we might have done differently, the major things we did could not have been done any earlier. Just to take you through it very quickly, I began working in the first meeting I had with George Bush with the cabinet in July. He asked me to speak about entitlements reform. At that time, I said to him, I would rather speak about the possibility of a financial crisis. And this was 2006, because I see a lot of excesses in the economy. He said, what would cause that crisis? I said, I don't know, sir, but afterwards it'll be obvious. And but we started working immediately with Fannie and Freddie. So beginning, those are the big giants that did the mortgage, a lot of the mortgage financing, and were at the center, I think, of the crisis. So I started working with Democrats in the Congress, and we could not get Congress to move to do anything with Fannie or Freddie until we got into 2008. Then in 2008, when Bear Stearns failed, and they're an investment bank, they were the first investment bank to go, although a number of investors had to come in and prop up Citigroup, Merrill Lynch, Morgan Stanley. When Bear Stearns started to go, we learned then, clearly we did not have necessary powers to save an investment bank that was failing. We had no emergency powers to put in a guarantee, a government guarantee, or put in capital. We needed a buyer. And so we got lucky and we got JP Morgan. And if we had not had JP Morgan as a buyer, the government could assist it, the Fed could assist it. But without that Fed assistance, Bear Stearns would have failed, Lehman would have gone right after, and we would not have even stabilized Fannie or Freddie. So right after we got done with Bear Stearns, I was up at Congress, and this is an excerpt from a video. And tell the story in the video, we went up to see Barney Frank, who ran the House Financial Services Committee, and we said, we need emergency powers to deal with a failing investment bank. We have none. And he said, we can't give them to you. The only chance you have is if you scream to Congress and to the American public, if we don't get them, an investment bank will fail and there'll be a disaster. Of course, if we'd done that, we would have precipitated it. So we started working, encouraging Lehman to raise capital, and I was able to finally get the emergency powers for Fannie and Freddie. And we got those just when they started to unravel. Now, I think we get very little credit for that because people, they didn't start to come unglued. They were 8 times bigger than Lehman Brothers, 9 times bigger. They had, $5.4 trillion in liabilities. If they'd had a failed auction, the whole system would have gone down. So then when Lehman went, we had Lehman, Merrill Lynch, and AIG all going at the same time. We didn't have emergency powers unless there was a buyer. We couldn't have, and so what happened was B of A bought Merrill. We got lucky. If they'd bought Lehman, Merrill would have gone down and it would have been worse.
And Barclays, why couldn't they buy Lehman?
Barclays, the regulator wouldn't approve it, okay? By this time, there only were 2 buyers because all the buyers that had come in, the Abu Dhabi Investment Company, Temasek in Singapore, the China's investment sovereign wealth fund, CIC, they'd come into firms like Morgan Stanley and Merrill Lynch and Citigroup earlier, and they'd lost money. And so there was no buyer. And then even after Lehman went, when we went to get the TARP, Congress voted it down the first time. So what you saw was a giant clash between politics and markets. And at the time, I was frustrated that it took Congress so long. I now look at the dysfunction in Washington.
You were extremely quick.
And I'm grateful that twice we got Congress to give us extraordinary powers before a crisis. With Fannie and Freddie, I needed unlimited. I said I wanted unlimited. And my staff said, the political advisor said, you can't ask for unlimited, so I asked for unspecified. And we got them. I hoped I wouldn't have to take the bazooka out of the pocket, which I said, but we got in. It was so bad we had to. And then with the TARP, we got them. So, but as you see, brevity is not one of my virtues. But the short answer to your question is, these excesses had been building up for years and years. And people always blame the banks when there's a problem. And maybe some other bankers here will agree with me when I say this, but few other people in this room will agree. Because people always blame the banks. The banks make all kinds of mistakes. They deserve a lot of blame. But every crisis has their roots in flawed government policies. And we had housing policies that encouraged home ownership and incentivized that so that residential home prices had only gone up in the United States since World War II. We'd had no nationwide decline in housing prices. And so if you bought a residential mortgage, the biggest risk you had was you get your money back too quickly. Because if rates dropped, people would refund. And so we had that bubble. There were all sorts of excesses. American people or the American households had doubled their borrowing from 97 to 2007. So we have an expression, the horse was already out of the barn by the time I got there, and we only had so many authorities.
At the end, the crisis was serious, but there was no meltdown. But the rebound has been much less fast than in the past. Why?
I think the reason is part of the problem, a big part of the problem was secular. It wasn't just cyclic. The bubble years had masked the problem and had masked what I view as a trend of structural unemployment that we had from 97 to 2007. Household income was flat. Households doubled their borrowing. As I said, people were living beyond their means, and they were buying product they couldn't afford to buy. They're buying homes they couldn't afford to buy. So the jobs to create that product and those homes were not real jobs. We were buying product from China we couldn't afford to buy. So we had this, and this wasn't just in the US. You look, the bubble was equally a European bubble. When between the time the European banks, accounting wasn't as good as the US banks. They had more leverage. They sat on the problems. Between the time we got TARP, I was in a dead sprint from August, when we started working to deal with Fannie or Freddie, through getting the TARP. We got the TARP on October 3rd, and from the time we went to Congress to get the TARP on the 18th, from then until the time we actually put the capital in our banks in the middle of October, we'd had 6 European countries have to come in and nationalize their banks. We had banks going down throughout Europe. And then the thing that we did right that the Europeans didn't do was we moved quickly to recapitalize our banking system. So we put capital in 700 banks, and that's why the stress tests work, and we moved to do that.
In fact, it was a big business for the U.S. Treasury.
Right.
But what were those structural problems? Why wasn't the U.S. economy growing as it should? Why was income being concentrated in such a way?
I think our structural problems, we have, I think to restore U.S. competitiveness, we need some structural fixes. Let me tick them off. I think we need a new personal income tax system and a federal income tax system.
What type of changes?
Well, we don't say with our federal income tax system is out of step with the whole rest of the world. And so I just think we have a system where we have too many loopholes, too many deductions. We need to eliminate many, if not most of them, reduce the rate. I think some form of consumption tax.
The IT type.
Could make sense. But you could go any one of a number of ways. The current system doesn't work. We have if you look at our entitlements programs, they're not sustainable. Healthcare is a big problem. We've extended coverage today, but we haven't fixed it structurally. Immigration is huge, okay, in terms of what that does. We have to fix it both at the low end and the high end. We take people in, people come from all over the world to get advanced degrees in the United States, then we make them leave, and go back and take what they've learned to their countries. So we have a big need to fix immigration. Education. So we have I guess our teachers unions aren't the same huge problem they are in your country, but they're
because you don't do the reforms.
But we still have a problem, and so we have some fundamental structural problems. And one of the things I learned during the crisis, it's hard to get Congress to act, to do big, difficult, messy, unpopular things, unless there is a crisis. And when we went up and asked Congress to vote for the TARP, they knew that was an unpopular vote, because I went up there and said, you know what, the financial system is frozen, the economy is going to turn way down in 6 months, but if we don't get these emergency powers, it's going to be economic, it's going to be Armageddon. And members of Congress immediately knew that if they voted, you'll never get credit for preventing a disaster that people didn't see. And so when I left office, there were polls that showed that the TARP, which I think was a very effective program, worked, prevented disaster, the money came back with a profit, but it was much more unpopular than torture in
It's
America.
still unpopular, even after the
Oh, yeah.
positive returns.
Oh, yeah, because people see the problems. They don't see the disaster that didn't happen. They don't like, no one likes a bailout.
Of course, but now, as you correctly said, Congress needs crisis to react, but your Congress is not even able to agree upon a budget. These reforms that the country needs seem to be much more complex than what politically your Congress can address.
Well, there's an issue. Now, I've talked about the political system, and I'm not an expert on the political system. But what I would say is that we have had structural problems in our Congress that I don't think the founding fathers ever could have imagined. We have this redistricting with the House of Representatives. I call it gerrymandering or legalized corruption, where parties have redrawn these electoral maps for House districts. And if a man from Mars came down, it makes no sense. But the only thing it does is to keep certain seats safe within a party. So about 80% of the seats in the House are not apt to be lost to the other party. So what you do is, if you're a Democrat, you're concerned about attack from the left, a Republican to the right, so that polarizes people. And the fastest way to not get elected is to compromise. And then the other thing which has happened, I don't know if this has happened in Mexico, but it's happened in the US. We used to get our news from similar sources. There are 3 networks, and we all had the same facts in the good old days. We would argue, but we had the same facts. Now, with the internet and all these blogs, people choose their facts. They need slower, higher quality, sustainable growth. I've got the environment and conservation on my mind because I'm here when we leave here, Roberto Hernandez and I are going to go to the Yucatan, and we jointly chair a big group that works on conservation for Latin America. And one of the things Roberto and I and many business leaders know is we've now reached the tipping point in the global economy where it's for growth to be sustainable, you're going to have to do it in a responsible way in terms of the environment. Because if we keep treating the global ecosystems like they're a free good, and we're not going to have the air we need to breathe, the water to drink, the food to eat, and so now the Chinese are so big and growing so quickly, they're confronting that really immediately. Now, I flew into Mexico City. I looked at your smog, and I said, it's starting to remind me a little bit of Beijing, but it's not quite there yet. But Beijing, people aren't going to accept the dirty air, the dirty water. Their leaders know it. Their leaders know the model doesn't work, and so they want slower, higher quality growth. So the next 4 years, I think right now, the good news is the economy is growing steadily at above 7%. But to me, they haven't done the hard part yet because it's still growing on the old model.
And they seem to have some sort of a bubble in terms of...
Yeah, they've got their own real estate bubble. The best way to describe their real estate bubble is this. They have, just like our Fannie and Freddie, they have a flawed structure, a financial structure. And it has to do with mayors and the urbanization process. If you're a mayor in China, you have all these responsibilities. You have to pay for education. If you're a mayor in the US, you get a lot of money from the federal government or for the state. In China, you have to pay for the health care, and you have to pay for pensions, and you build infrastructure. And so over half of the spending is done at the municipal level. But mayors aren't given much revenues. most of the receipts go to the taxes, go to the federal government, and only 25% of those go back to the provincial or the county or the city government. So what do mayors do to fund their growth? They do two things. They have to rely on opaque financing mechanisms that really aren't sustainable. They don't have budget responsibility. They don't have financial statements that they're responsible for. They go to state-owned enterprises and push them to build infrastructure. And you know how they fund much of their growth? They take land from the farmers and they sell it. Now that's the thing that makes people even angrier than in China than the dirty air is land abuses, where if you're a farmer and you use the land and the mayors sell that to developers, and that revenue pays the interest on the money they borrow from state-owned banks in off-balance sheet, illiquid, not illiquid, it is illiquid, but off-balance sheet, opaque vehicles. So almost every financial crisis has its roots in short-term borrowing, these what I call shadow banking. Short-term borrowing, funding long-term assets. Now, if you fund that with deposits, that's pretty dependable. When you fund that with land sales, and why do you have a bubble in real estate? Because if you're an investor in China, you don't have good things to invest in. You put your money into banks, you don't get anything close to the level of inflation. The stock market has been very unreliable, so people put their money in real estate.
Is it sustainable? Are they like the U.S. in 2006?
The vehicle for funding isn't sustainable. I happen to believe right now they have the resources to manage it. There's, who knows, they're doing another audit. They understand the problem, they're doing an audit. I don't know whether it'll be 12 trillion renminbi or what will be in those off-balance sheet debt. But right now, the banks have got big earnings, and the federal government has got reserves to deal with these kinds of things. But if you let it go on too long, and let me hasten to say, when I'm quickly to say it's manageable, by definition, a bubble by definition is people don't know the true impact until it bursts, right? So we didn't in the U.S. So I'm looking at it and I'm saying, yeah, I think it's manageable, but you sure better start managing it. That's the bad news. The good news is they understand it, okay? If you talk to the top bankers, the Minister of Finance, the BBOC, the leaders, they understand this problem better than I do, and they're working on it.
Well, let's return to America. One of the big impacts for Mexico was, of course, the emergence of China. When we signed NAFTA, China was not mentioned one single time. The whole idea was Mexico is going to win from NAFTA because we're the cheapest guy in the block. We'll be able to win from it. Here comes China, happens what happens. But now they're more expensive. They are starting to be less competitive. Money is even returning to the U.S.
I'm glad you brought this up because I see one of the things I was very disappointed about was, and I'm a big George Bush fan. I think he was a terrific boss for me during the crisis. I couldn't have done the things I did if he didn't say, "You're my wartime general," if he weren't, I was accessible all the time, understood what was going on, was prepared to make these decisions. Now, he saw the importance of Latin America. He wanted to make Mexico and the U.S. relationships with Mexico and Latin America a big part of what he did. We got sucked into the Iraq War. I look at what's going on right now, and I'm doing with the Paulson Institute. The Paulson Institute is focused on the economic relationship between the U.S. and China and cross-border investment. But as we study this, and I look at what's happening in the U.S., I look at what's happening in China with wage rates going up, manufacturing costs going up. I look at the global supply chain, the global production chain I look at energy costs in the U.S. coming down.
Labor costs.
Labor staying steady. I look at manufacturing coming back here, and then I look at this region in NAFTA, and I look at what's happening in Mexico with your leader, with your president, Peña. If he's able to get, I know these reforms are difficult, but labor reform, which is fiscal reform and the energy reform, if you can get some of these things and get your economy going, the growth we can have in this region. So I think one of the big neglected areas for the U.S. economy to create growth, and for Mexico and for Latin America, if you look at Mexico, but if you just really if you look at Chile and Peru and Colombia and some of these countries that are really making great progress, we should be doing much more with trade, and there should be a bigger focus. I think there's a tremendous potential in terms of a focus on this part of the world. And I think it makes sense from an economic standpoint, from a national security standpoint, and I think fixing our immigration. When I came to start working with President Bush in 2006, and I turned down the job twice, and the third time I was persuaded. And when I was talking about priorities, and he had wanted me to work, which I was interested in terrorism, finance, and on entitlements. And I said, what's your top priority? Thinking he would say one of those. And he said, my top priority was immigration. And he said, if we don't fix this when I'm here as a Republican, he said, I think it's going to be very difficult to fix, and it will divide our country for a long time. And he put forward a proposal, and for a while we thought we were going to get it done. And it's very similar to what's being debated now and not getting done. But that's got with a guest worker program, with a program to really fix immigration, I think would also do a lot for our economy.
If you were the president of Mexico, where would you focus in terms of gaining advantage?
It's like, boy, I tell you, I'm practicing without a license now, right? But why not, right? It's just like so I was really glad he went after the teachers union, because there you've got big time corruption, and and this is your children you're dealing with in your future. And what's more important than education? I see Claudia nodding her head. I know she spends time on education. I mean, we should all care about education. So that was the right area. The informal labor market, you've got to fix that. So he went there. The tax area, that was important. Energy, we're all hopeful on energy, because does it make sense? Look at your energy resources, look at what you've got, and look at what's happening. I mean, anybody looks at it from 100,000 feet, you don't have to be an expert to know there's something wrong in your system, right? And so, but sometimes knowing there's something wrong and fixing it are two different things. And so I think you've got strong leadership, and let's just hope, and if some of these things, to me, you got an economy that's limping along at 1%, and we're limping along at 2%. I think your economy is a lot easier to get to 5% growth than ours is to get to 4%, or 3.5% if you can get these structural forms. And a little uptick in the U.S. will help you a lot. And I think we're going to get an uptick in the U.S.
What are your expectations of the U.S. economy growing in the next years? How much? What do you think will happen?
Again, where we've been growing at 2%, más o menos. How did you like my Spanish? So we've been, and it's been menos, not más. So we've been under 2%. Now, and that's been quite an achievement because people don't really understand. There's a lot of discussion about QE3 and what Ben Bernanke's been doing. And, you know, that's going to have to end because you can't, you know, you have these extraordinarily low interest rates for a long time. They're distortional and they just can't go on forever. But when you look at what it's accomplished, I give the Fed and their policies a lot of credit because we've had to go through a huge deleveraging. When you look at the banks deleveraging and households deleveraging and still growing at 2%, that's some achievement. I think to get a meaningful uptick in growth, we're going to need some action out of Washington. But I'd be hopeful that if we don't have more dysfunction and disruption, even without structural reform, if business can stop worrying about the uncertainty with when you look at some of the things we've got coming in new technologies and 3D printing and some of the other things we have coming in the life sciences area and in the robotics area in the U.S., I think we're going to have to see more growth. But I think to get where we need to get, it's going to take some structural change in Washington.
But that new growth will be extremely unequal because this technology will probably tend to reinforce the current inequality.
Yeah, we talked a little bit beforehand, and I gave my view. Everybody's got their view as to what's happened to U.S. jobs. And all of the analysis I've done has shown they haven't really gone offshore. They've been eaten up by technology. And so technology is a good thing in many ways. It drives productivity. It creates a lot of good things for any country. You can't be against it. But if you even take a look at manufacturing, when I was a Treasury Secretary, I looked at the numbers, and basically we had very similar to the same number of people working in manufacturing in the U.S., you know, in 2008 as we had in 1950, but we had 8 times the output. And if you walk through a factory floor, you don't see people, you see robotics. But in every industry, if you look at architecture, you look at law, you look at engineering, technology destroys a lot of jobs. It makes people more productive at the top. There's always going to be jobs at the bottom. But I think we need to diagnose the problem correctly and focus on skills training and making sure people have the skills. And it's not going to be a college degree for everyone. You know, a plumber in New York City makes $150,000 a year. It's going to be, how do we have the skills we need to be productive in today's world?
Well, I think Alejandro is roaming around. He probably wants to interrupt us.
No, we would love to have your knowledge here for a lot of days, but we understand you have an important meeting at the Yucatan Peninsula, so we don't want to abuse that, and we just want to give you a big applause.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very
Thank
much
you.
for